Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming for our first event in the Patricia Ramsay Civic Engagement Series here at Merrill Memorial Library. My name is Judy Clark. I'm the Assistant Director here at Merrill Memorial. I'm very happy to have Bill Gross and Dr. Steve Horowitz here to speak to you about dying with dignity. The Civic Engagement Series was generously created in Pat's memory. She was a long-standing trustee and volunteer by Steve, her husband, from generous donations given in her memory. And we are going to continue to do other programs in Pat's memory, so please keep your eyes out for those in the future. To begin with, I will have Dr. Steve and Bill begin the conversation. So thank you for coming.
Can you hear me? Not terribly well. Let me close this. How about now?
Yeah.
Now, good? All right, all right. Well, my name is Steve Horowitz. I was very happily married to Patricia Ramsay for forever, I thought. It's about 41 years. We have created this Patricia Ramsay Civic Engagement Series because of her commitment to a lot of civil activities, civil rights, elections, and all the rest of that, which I will tell you about. And we were very fortunate to have a fair number of donations that are helping to fund this series. I thought my part of this presentation would take two parts. One is I would explain her career and the activities that she did, and then the next to tell you some personal observations about our relationship and her choices at the end of life. So she got started in civic activities when she was living in Worcester, Massachusetts in the early 70s, and she had two young children. I didn't know her then. I didn't meet her until 1982. But she had two young children, and there was a group of lawyers in Worcester that were doing pro bono work for the ACLU, and they needed to set up an office, and they needed someone to manage the office. And they hired Pat. And according to one of those lawyers whom I spoke to last week, she was so terrific in terms of being able to organize the office, understand which cases were of value to the ACLU, and screen many of these cases that they could or could not take, that she was written up in the Boston Globe and the local Worcester newspapers. When she and her family decided to move to New York, her reputation was such that she joined the national office of the ACLU and worked on the Women's Rights Project, of which she was the project manager, and the consultant in that program was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And according to this lawyer that I spoke with, Ruth Bader Ginsburg thought that Pat was terrific. So she worked on this Women's Rights Project at the ACLU for about 10 years, and then moved to a public relations firm. The public relations firm had contacts and clients from all over the world. So she started traveling. She represented the government of Angola, and she flew to Angola several times. She was fascinated because she flew on the Concorde from New York to Paris and back, and then from there down to Angola. Amongst the other clients was the National Resources Defense Council, the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund, and Planned Parenthood. So she was really involved with a lot of nonprofits that were involved with abortion rights and climate and things like that. One of the clients who was very interesting, it was the British Labour Party. And the head of the British Labour Party at that time, in the late 80s and early 90s, was a man named Neil Kinnock. I met him several times. He was very charming. And Pat used to take him around the country to introduce him to politicians in the United States, especially in Washington. He related a story to Pat that when she took him to the White House to meet President Reagan, he was supposedly scripted in terms of the questions he could ask. And Reagan had 3x5 cards with the answers to the questions as they were programmed. And somewhere in the middle of the conversation that they had, Reagan got the 3x5 cards mixed up and started answering questions that weren't asked. In any event, Neil Kinnock ran for Prime Minister of England, of Great Britain, in 1992. And Pat was one of his consultants, and had he been elected, she would have been his foreign press secretary, and we would have probably ended up moving to London. But the story was that I think the election was on April 8th, and the Brits have a much better system of campaigning than we do. They allow 6 weeks rather than 6 years. And so she went over there for 6 weeks, and I said, listen, you can stay there as long as you want, but we have a deal. My 50th birthday is April 10th, and you have to be back by then, because my friends from childhood and I are all having a reunion. We used to meet every 5 years, and the reunion was in the Bahamas, and you had to show up. And so stay there as long as you want, but be back on April 9th. So on April 9th, she flew from London to the Bahamas. And when she had left, Kinnock was winning. And then we get to the Bahamas, and she said, let me call London and see how he's doing. And it turned out that he lost by a few thousand votes, which ended her career in England and my need to move to London with her. After that, we moved to Missouri, because I was chief of neurology at the University of Missouri, and she was in the development program. And the University of Missouri had some very interesting relationships. Harry Truman, as you know, was from Missouri, and he engineered a program after he retired from the presidency. He engineered a program with the university to bring over students from South Korea to study at the university. And that started in the late 50s and 60s. And so by the time we got to Missouri in 1995, many of the students were obviously well into their careers, and some of them had been very successful and were businessmen and lawyers and doctors and what have you, and were donating to the program. So the chancellor would go over to Asia at least once a year, and Pat was his favorite partner, so he took her with him. They would go to South Korea, to Taiwan, Thailand, Singapore, other places like that, to develop programs and generate donations from former students and prospective new students. So there was a nice program going on there that she had a big role in, and she continued to travel all over the world in order to do that. Then, in 2000, we had our first grandchild. And the first grandchild was in Maine. And Pat says to me about a year later that, you know, it took all day to get from Columbia, Missouri to Portland, Maine. One time I timed it. I left the house at 8 in the morning, and we got to Portland at 7 at night. There was an hour change, but it was still a 10-hour trip because we had to drive to St. Louis. There were no direct flights from St. Louis. We had to change somewhere. And so one day she comes to me and says, "You could be the chief of neurology out here in the middle of nowhere, but the dog and I are moving to Maine, and we hope you join us." So I gave up a good part of my academic career, and I moved to Maine. So shortly after we moved, and we were trying to make friends and figure out what to do, we were invited to a Christmas party, and I sat next to a lovely gentleman who's here now, and we started talking, and I thought, well, maybe this guy could be a friend. So I introduced him to Pat, and they start talking, and in a few minutes, they're gone. John Wustorf over here had been a volunteer with the OSCE, the Organization for, what is it, the organization, I have it written there, for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and they monitor elections throughout the world. So he recruited her, and off she went a few months later to various places. She would go for about a 2-week period each time. The first place she went was Kyrgyzstan. Now, how many of you know where Kyrgyzstan is? She apparently lived in a hut for a week and then somewhere else, and then she went to Belarus and Ukraine and Macedonia and several other places to monitor the elections. So she really got involved with a lot of these civic things. And of course, once we moved to Yarmouth, the library was the focus of her attention. And she volunteered here for many years in all sorts of manners, fundraising, whatever, but was then a long-standing trustee here at the institution. And that's why this institution held such an important place for her. So that was her career, and you can see how involved she was with a whole variety of the issues. And let me tell you a little bit about her personally. We met in 1982. We were introduced by a couple, both of whom were lawyers and who had nothing to do with the outdoors. She knew the wife and I knew the husband. And Pat had gone on an outward bound trip a few months before that in Oregon, where she was camping out on her own for several days. And I had done a cross-country hut-to-hut ski tour through the Adirondacks. And these people thought, well, we're both outdoor people, maybe we'll like each other. And they introduced us, and we met at a dinner. After that, we were pretty inseparable. We started dating, but she wanted to keep her independence. So we met in February of '82, and in March of '82, I said to her, listen, I have rented a ski house up in the Berkshires. Perhaps you'll join me for a weekend. And her first response was, well, if I don't like it, how do I get home? So I said, I'll drive you to the train. Of course, she liked it. We went up again. We went up for years. We bought a house up there. We had a second home, and everything went well. But that was her first concern. If I don't like it, how do I get out of here? Then in 1984, we moved in together, and she didn't want to give up her apartment that she had in Manhattan, so she sublet it and continued to live with me. And it took me a while to convince her to get married. I kept asking, and she wasn't so sure, and so on. And finally, what had happened was that I had a good friend of mine who owned a very nice restaurant in New York, and I told him that he offered to host the wedding. So one day she said yes to me. So I called him up. I said, Stuart, call her, make a date, make sure that this is definite. And off we went. And then we got married. But she kept her independence, she kept her bank account while we were living together for 6 or so years in New York. I tell you that because of her independence, her thinking that she wanted to do things on her own, and how interested she was in keeping that independence. Now, one of the issues that came up was that when we moved, it was the question of Alzheimer's in people that we knew. My father had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and I knew about that. And her mother. In 1987, her mother lived on the Cape, and we would drive up from New York to Cape Cod every summer and visit her mother. And I know the years, I'll tell you why in a minute, but in 1987, we got a little suspicious that she wasn't doing quite as well as she had in the past. And she was a widow and living alone. And then the next year, we said, well, okay, we're going to go up and make a diagnosis. And as we were driving up, Michael Dukakis was giving his acceptance speech in the Democratic National Convention, so we knew it was 1988. And we saw that her mother had deteriorated a bit. And eventually, we had her mother moved to a senior citizen center on the Cape, and she lived there for a few years. Shortly after we moved to Missouri in '95, they called us and told us that her mother was not able to be continued over there. And so we had to move her to Missouri, which was an arduous process. Pat had to go there and physically move her to Missouri, and we moved her into a memory care facility where she continued to deteriorate. The memory care facility was on our way home from work at the university, so Pat would stop by there frequently, and she would have visual and visceral evidence that her mother was deteriorating. And her mother was a very proper, upstanding woman, and to see her deteriorate was very damaging psychologically to Pat. And Pat said afterwards, this is terrible, and I don't want that to happen to me. We had a deal with the doctor there that if her mother developed anything other than the Alzheimer's, that they wouldn't treat it. Well, her mother had relatively frequent urinary tract infections, and despite the doctor's agreement not to treat the mother, except to provide pain medications, she was treated anyway, which infuriated Pat and me because our wishes were not obeyed. But that situation sat in her mind and dictated what came afterwards. So her mother passed away in 2005. Both of us agreed that we wouldn't want to be in the same situation under those circumstances. And then we started taking courses at OLLI, at USM, and one of the courses that we took in 2010, 2011 was given by Bill on end-of-life issues, and we were introduced to voluntary stopping eating and drinking. And we thought, okay, both of us said, this is probably what we want to do. And Pat got more and more committed to that. And then she started to recognize that she had some word-finding difficulties. She probably recognized this before I did, but it was late 2019 or early 2020, and one of the first things that she did was resign from the Board of Trustees because she didn't want to be embarrassed. And writing and talking were major components of her career. She had written articles, she had given lectures, working with the ACLU. It was important that she be as verbal as possible. So when she recognized that she had some word-finding problems, she wanted to resign rather than embarrass herself. And then I started to see problems like forgetting the keys and not being able to use the stove correctly and not finding objects in the kitchen that she usually did and things like that. She was able to continue driving and socializing, and she was up on political and cultural activities, but this became an increasing problem. We had signed up for a place at Ocean View, and we moved to Ocean View in June of 2022, and that was very helpful. People there were very supportive. We didn't have to travel to go to the gym or lectures or concerts or things like that, and she was very happy there. It's interesting that she made friends there, and many of them did not recognize that she had cognitive issues because she could hold conversations intelligently. It was remarkable, actually, that she could do that. At the same time, she couldn't cook. She never learned to use the stove. She would start to hallucinate and think that there were other people in the cottage that we lived in. I found it very interesting that if we went out for dinner, either to a restaurant or to a friend's house, when we came home, she knew we were home. If we stayed home and had dinner at home, at the end of the dinner, even after cleaning up, she would say, "Take me home." I said, "Well, you are home. Here's our furniture, here's our television, here's a picture of you on the wall." And she couldn't recognize it if we had stayed at home. And of course we were staying home more and more because she was having more and more problems. Even though I took her outside and showed her the mailbox and showed her the car and all of that, it didn't matter. So the cognitive issues were becoming more intense. And then she started talking about VSED. She actually wrote a letter to whom it may concern in September of 2020 that nobody saw for almost 3 years, in which she explains that before she gets to the point where she can't make decisions on her own, she wants out with the voluntary stopping and eating program. And she uses as an example her great concern about the way in which her mother's situation was handled. So she wrote a 3-page letter that no one saw for a couple of years, in which she very forcefully, and then I have notes that she wrote before she composed the letter, because the letter was typed out. And so she had made notes to herself earlier in 2020 that how important this decision was to her. So she wanted to make sure that she was still cognitively intact when she passed away. Because if there's a catch-22 situation with Alzheimer patients and patients with cognitive issues in terms of making that decision. If she's too far along, then she's not considered competent to make the decision. If she's competent to make the decision, then there are times in which she's going to be having fun and enjoying life and relating to friends and children and so on. But she wanted to make sure that the decision was hers while she was competent and everybody would agree. So we engaged a counselor, a doula, who's here today and who helped us understand the process of VSED and who counseled Pat over several months on the VSED situation. And the doula came to us one day on September 28th last year and said, we can schedule you on 2 dates. We can schedule you on October 2nd or November 1st. I said, wait a second. October 2nd is only 2-3 days away, so let's pick November 1st. So we picked November 1st. And November 1st was on a Wednesday. So the doula said, you can eat as much, drink as much as you want until that Monday, at which point you can have a banana and an egg on Monday and Tuesday, and then we start the voluntary stopping eating and drinking. And Pat had been aware of this issue for many months. Her normal weight was somewhere around 118, 120. And when she went to see her primary care doc the week before we started the VSED, she was 98 pounds. So she was preparing for this over time and slowly lost weight. On that weekend, that Saturday and Sunday, I said, I'll make you our favorite dishes and you'll eat them before you start the program. The favorite dish was the lobster risotto, which is really delicious. And she ate that on the Saturday night, but then she didn't eat the dinner on Sunday night, and then had a banana and an egg on Monday, and then just the banana on Tuesday, and then started the whole process that Wednesday. So the point to be made here is that she wanted to be in charge. She wanted to make her decisions. Like she wanted to go back to New York if she didn't like the house in the mountains, or she wanted to be sure that she was cognitively intact and that she was in control and that she never deteriorated the way her mother did. And we had a great relationship, and it was pretty taxing for me as a caregiver to go through with this, because she would leave the house with one sock on. She would mismatch her shoes. She wouldn't know where her keys were. And so but then we would go out and we would have a fine time and we could discuss lots of interesting topics. So I'm saying to myself, am I ready for this? Is this the right time? Is November 1st the right time? And I said, well, I'm going to grieve because we had such a great relationship. Is it going to matter to me if I grieve starting in 3 months or if I start on November 1st? And I came around to seeing that it didn't matter. If she wanted to leave on November 1st or start the VSED program on November 1st, then that was fine. That was fine with me. And today is the year anniversary of her passing, and And interestingly, whereas people who knew how this program worked told me that it would take 2 weeks, in her case it only took 8 days, because she had been preparing in advance. And we had had a great relationship, and I'm sorry, I still miss her. Every day I go in and I talk to her and tell her what's going on. And the fact that she took me on as a husband was a real treat. I mean, you know, people who know me know that I'm reasonably personable and charming and reasonably intelligent, but I'm certainly not good looking. She was personable and charming, intelligent, and good looking. Who would you choose? These are pictures taken shortly after we met. Who would you choose? Even in the last few years, who would you choose? Come on. So she took me on. In fact, in today's Portland Press Herald, there's an in memoriam notice. And I called them earlier in the week, and I said, you know, let's put this in on November 8th. And the woman who took my order called up her photograph from the obituary and said, oh, she was really good looking. And I said I was grateful that she took care of me. Anyway, Bill's going to talk about this VSED program. I wanted to give you the program in the context of Pat and why we have started this civic engagement series. The series has been funded very generously by donations from friends all over the country, and I'm glad that it's being recorded because they can watch it, and I'm very thankful to them for having made these donations in Pat's name. So thank you for listening, and Bill can come up now and talk about VSED specifically, and I'll answer any questions afterwards.
So what I'm going to do, Steve has told you a lot about the personal side of Pat's decision to VSED, as we say, to voluntarily stop eating and drinking. And since this is a civic engagement series, I wanted to put her decision in the context of civic engagement, and to say that Pat's chosen way of dying might be a model or challenge us to think about the end of life and what would we want to do, each of us. Not that you should do what Pat did. Your circumstances may be entirely different than Pat's circumstances at the end of your life. And probably most of you don't know how the end of your life is going to be because you drove over here, or you're sitting down, you're listening, you're healthy. But we can think about circumstances, think about scenarios. And how, when we think about those things, how might we set things up so that our wishes could be honored? Steve told us Pat wrote this 3-page letter, which pretty well clarified things. And they talked to each other. Her choice to die with dignity was to not go through the entire process of Alzheimer's that she saw her mother go through. So, in thinking about how you might die, how do we gain clarity about that? Well, I think you can envision, as Pat probably did. She envisioned the experience of her mother. Talk in detail to people that you love about what you want or you don't want. Would you be happy dying in an ICU, undergoing attempts at curative treatment to the very end, fighting to stay alive? Or would you rather not be in an ICU so that you could actually be with your family, be home maybe, and talk to them and help them process your dying? Well, most people say they want to die at home, and yet a lot of people don't die at home. So I want to address the issue of how do you plan ahead so that you increase the likelihood of dying in a way that you would like. The most important thing is to appoint a healthcare proxy. Oh, I have a pointer here, but I think you can all read. Appoint a healthcare proxy. This is a person who legally, you give the legal right to make decisions, medical decisions on your behalf if you no longer can make those decisions yourself. And this is critically important. Of course, the agent has to know what you would like. You know, would you like to be resuscitated if you have a heart attack in the hospital or on the street? Would you like to be treated for urinary tract infection that Steve mentioned? Or would you rather let that be the door that takes you out of the world? It used to be that pneumonia was called the old man's friend. I see some heads nod. Because that was a reasonably good way to die. But now, pneumonia gets treated. So one thing you could think about is, so if I'm at the end of my life, I know what's going to kill me, it's coming up, and I have this, let's say this alternate escape route through pneumonia. Would I rather take that, or would I rather go on and prolong my life a little longer? And what's the quality of that life? And that's the important key issue as well. So the agent has to know everything about you. And some people say, oh yeah, I talked to my agent about that. How many times? Oh, well, how many times do you have to say it? You know, once is good enough. No, it's not good enough at all. Because as you age, you find out other things about yourself. I might have a bad heart. I might have bad organs in various places. I might have dementia. All these things vary what you might think of as a positive end of life for yourself. So it's a constant process, and not just with your agent, although that's the most important, but with your family members as well. There are stories about an estranged family member from California, of course, because that's far away. An estranged family member from California comes in at the last minute and says, well, what do you mean? What do you mean you're not going to do everything to save? You have a do not resuscitate order? Well, it's too bad that person wasn't in the loop. And so came to understand how it is at the end of life. This is a person who's going to die, and the question is how much suffering do we want to put him or her through to keep them alive? And so part of the advance directive is identifying and appointing your healthcare proxy. But the healthcare directive, how many people have healthcare directives? Oh, that's great. Yeah, you're an informed group. And so I don't need to say a lot about that, but the advance directive allows you to describe in great detail if you want. You can check boxes, or you can also write paragraphs about how you envision your end of life. So what are the considerations? I've already alluded to some of these. Things to think about when the end of life is near, and maybe even now. My quality of life, is it so compromised that my suffering is intolerable? Are there treatments that will cure me? Or are there treatments that will merely prolong my life and prolong my suffering as well? Is now the time to forego curative treatments and choose palliative care? Hospice, a decision to enter hospice means you will forego curative treatments and you receive palliative care. And interestingly, several studies have shown that people who enter palliative care or enter hospice early actually live longer than would be expected relative to people who stayed fighting to the end and receiving potentially curative treatments. But at the end, there are no curative treatments, so it's a toss-up. By the way, if there are questions as we go along, I'd like to entertain those questions as we go, unless it gets too time-consuming. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll recognize you. So here we get to the issue of hastening death. When suffering becomes the prominent feature of a person's life, quality of life is no longer adequate, perhaps, to that person. Of course, it's different for every person. One person said, long as I can drink a beer and watch the Pats, I'm good. That wouldn't be good enough for me. But it's variable to each individual. And when suffering is unbearable or death is inevitable, I think it's important to realize that hastening death isn't really suicide. These people want to live. It's not like they're trying to end their lives, but they don't have a life to live. And that's a very different situation. Maine has recognized the fact that this is not suicide in the Death with Dignity law that was passed a few years ago. Does everybody know about that law? How many people know about it? Yeah, most of you do. So this law allows a physician to write a lethal prescription under certain circumstances, and I'll go through the circumstances. It's pretty detailed. But then that prescription taken will result in death within a few hours. The other option for hastening death is the one that Pat took, the voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. And it's available without the restrictions that attend to the Death with Dignity Act. So here I'll go over the Death with Dignity Act restrictions, how to access it a little bit. I'll try to do that quickly. A patient must have a terminal illness, this is the key thing, and a expected life expectancy of 6 months or less. This is the same criteria for entering hospice. So if you have a terminal illness like Lou Gehrig's disease or Alzheimer's disease, unless you're at the very, very end of your process with that disease, you don't qualify for death with dignity because you won't die. You're not expected to die in the next 6 months. So that's a major limitation for death with dignity. You have to be a Maine resident, you have to be 18 years of age or more, and you must have decision-making capacity. Steve mentioned this, that Pat was very much aware she wanted to end her life while she still had the ability to make that decision. And decision-making capacity means you're able to understand the diagnosis, understand the process. If you take a lethal prescription, what that's going to do to you. You're able to make free and independent decision, not coerced. And also, it's a decision not influenced by depression. And if the doctors decide that you might be depressed and could be treated with an antidepressant and have an otherwise good life, they will require a review by a psychiatrist or a psychologist to determine that. And the other requirement is that the patient has to be able to self-administer this prescription. Normally that means drinking 2 to 4 ounces of a pretty bad tasting mix of medicines, followed by something nice like ice cream or I don't know what, popsicle. Most people can do that. But so it means that someone can't give it to you, can't hold the glass and tip it into your mouth. So that's a fairly serious limitation. And if one can't swallow, like maybe someone with Lou Gehrig's disease, if the muscles here aren't working anymore, then you're stuck. There are some other ways around that, other forms of self-administration, but that's a major thing. So what's the procedure? So we went through those requirements. Now what's the procedure though? Well, you have to make an oral request to your so-called attending, this is in the law, the attending physician, who would probably be your primary care physician. And you have to have both the attending and another called the consultant physician. They both have to confirm the patient's eligibility. Basically, that's you have this disease and you're at a stage where you're likely to die in the next 6 months. So it takes 2 doctors to attest to that. And then after you have made the oral request, you have to write a written request within 15 days with 2 witnesses signing it. And you have to make a second oral request within those 15 days. So you could do both those at the same time. Then there's a 48-hour waiting period before the prescription is written. I have a friend whose wife died during that waiting period. So this is an area where the law may change at some point in the future. Some states have already modified the law in that way. And then the prescription is prepared by a compounding pharmacy. What this means is you can't just go to your pharmacy and they've got it on the shelf. Somebody in some other organization, we have compounding pharmacies in Maine, so it's not a long way away, but it has to be prepared specially. And it's a mixture of several different compounds. Comes to you in powdered form, and it'll be mixed with some apple juice or water or something, and shaken up. It doesn't dissolve, so you have kind of a slurry that you have to get down within 2 minutes. And so after a patient ingests that, the patient quickly falls asleep within minutes, typically, and then becomes comatose and typically dies within a few hours. Now, there's no real clock schedule on this. Sometimes it takes much longer, and the longer it takes, of course, the more anxiety for the family members who are typically at the bedside. expecting their loved one to die as they wanted, and it's not happening yet. So that's one reason to have a doula. Steve mentioned having a doula, who's a person trained specifically to be at the bedside and to explain to the family what's going on, to tell them after an hour if the patient's not dead. That's not unusual. Listen to the breathing. You can see the patient is comatose. Things are going okay. It's just going to take a little longer. So having a doula can be a very important part of the process. So let me see. Are there any questions about medical aid in dying before I move on to VSED? Yes, Bones.
I was just going to mention that one of the things that a death guide can also do is to do the mixture and all of that, so it doesn't have to be part of the family's, I'm nervous of doing it wrong, and so we're trained, some of us taking a course on it, to do this, just to take that away.
Mm-hmm.
And you have mentioned how you can actually self-administer with a plunger type item and stuff. There are some ways.
Yeah, there are creative ways.
And one last thing is, if you're even considering this, it's good to have it in your back pocket if it's something you're considering, because it does take quite a while to get it to go on. So as soon as you think it might be something you want to have in your back pocket, do it, and you don't have to use it. Because I've had several people never use it.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good point. One I had in mind to mention, but I didn't. So if you say, well, the pain isn't so bad now, or my quality of life isn't really so bad now, but I know the end is fairly imminent, as Andrew said, go ahead, start the process, get the medication. Because you have it doesn't mean you have to take it. And having someone who has mixed the medication before is an important thing, relieves the family members of having to do it. You might think, well, how hard can it be? I'll just take this powdery stuff and I'll pour it into the water or the apple juice. Well, what about aerosolizing those particles while you were pouring it in? That's not so good. So you want to pour the liquid into the powdered mixture, not the other way around. Little things like that are important. Anything else on the death with dignity?
Just the consulting, the attending consulting physicians. Is that often hard to find your physician and the consultant to say you are eligible? Is there a lot of pushback, or is there, presumably if you had the same doctor for a long time, they would know, but what if you haven't?
Some doctors will feel uncomfortable participating in death with dignity. I think that's unfortunate, and I think it will probably change over time, so that more and more people will feel comfortable with that. But if your doctor doesn't feel comfortable, that doctor should say so. And if the doctor says, well, I think it's a little early for that, let's talk about that later, that's, to me, a red flag that the doctor's not comfortable. And so you should say, well, are you going to prescribe for me? And I want to start now. And if the doctor doesn't want to, the doctor is under a responsibility to refer you to someone who will help you. Yes?
Are there any religions that are opposed to this?
Sure. You probably know one. Yeah, the Catholic Church has been very vocal in opposing such legislation. That's probably the most vocal. But I'm sure there are a lot of more conservative denominations that think only God can take a life. My my favorite story about that is there's a woman on a respirator, comatose, been that way for 6 months. They have to take care of her lips and her skin and move her every 20 minutes around the clock. And the family's called in by the team, the medical team, and they say, well, do you want us to keep doing this, or should we just remove the respirator and let her die? Maybe they said pass. But and the response from the agent, the healthcare agent, was, oh, no, only God can decide. And when I talk about this in a classroom setting, somebody always says, I think God already decided. And the medical team's not on board. So there are a lot of religious complications to this.
I'd just like to augment slightly. There is an organization here in Maine, Maine Death with Dignity. They have a website one can Google. But my understanding is that they have a list of physicians who would be or might be available as consultants or people to help one go through the process where physician authorization is necessary.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that, having talked to the person at Maine Death with Dignity, but I have on the last page identified that organization and their website so that you could go and look them up and give them a call if you wanted to. Anything else on death with dignity? Okay, so what about voluntarily stopping eating and drinking? Well, you heard Steve's story about Pat. This is available to anybody. There are no legal restrictions, as there are with the death with dignity law. It's not a painful death, and it's not starvation. A lot of people think, oh my God, I'm starving my loved one to death, or I could never do that, I'd be starving myself. But it's not starving that kills you. That would take a really long time. What happens is you get dehydrated, and the primary bodily functions just can't maintain themselves. Electrolyte imbalances and a lot of things happen. So it's typically not painful, and it is important, I think, to have hospice on board, because there can be some discomfort when a person goes into a coma, and you might say, well, is this pain, or is this what's the source of this discomfort? Well, hospice can administer small doses of morphine just inside the mouth. It's just absorbed easily, or they can prescribe Ativan, which might just help the patient relax a little bit. So hospice is an important group to have on board, I think, as Steve mentioned. And generally it takes a couple of weeks, 1 to 6 weeks, I've said here. It can take, if it takes much longer than 2 or 3 weeks, it's probably because the patient is treating the dry mouth with ice chips, which is water, which counts as drinking. And so even a little bit of that apparently can extend the time it takes. What is often done is to satisfy that dryness in the mouth is to use glycerin swabs. You can get them in various flavors. They're on a little stick like this, and one patient I know called them lollipops. Want another lollipop? That helps. And hospice support should be arranged in advance. I'll have a little more to say about that. My last point here was a question. Is my loved one dying? And the reason I put that in, I didn't know where to put it, so I put it on this slide. This is a big question. If your loved one is in a hospital, it's difficult to realize that they are dying because they're getting treated, right? And treatment, they give treatments, why? To get people better. So, and doctors often have a hard time telling their family members of their patient, your loved one is going to die. It's not comfortable, and they're not, well, it's just a difficult thing for many doctors to do. There's the video I use in my teaching that shows a patient in a big New York City hospital, top of the line hospital, and the agent, healthcare agent for this dying man is his sister, and she's in a room with about 6 doctors and 4 nurses, and she says, "Look, I just want an answer, clear answer to this one question. Is my brother dying?" The doctors and nurses are like this. Oh. Finally, one speaks. "Well, what do you think, Gladys?" That's, to my mind, I don't know what to say about it. So they made Gladys say, "I think he's not going to leave the hospital." And then the doctors felt like, "Well, we agree with you, we think." But why is it so hard? I don't know. So just beware of that, I guess. And the other thing is, when someone stops eating and drinking, to me, that's the point at which I know this person is dying. Now, the person could say in 2 days, "Oh, I decided not to do that. Let's have some ice cream." But for someone who's committed to VSED, that's the point at which the person is dying. And it's kind of an unmistakable threshold. And for that reason, can be kind of a comfort in a certain way to family members. Yes?
I should have asked this question before, but because of the way hospitals are now organized with hospitalists, if you're taken into the hospital and your family member has not been notified or is slow to respond, and your doctor doesn't know, you can let the doctor know, but it's not the doctor who sees you in the hospital, that the hospital itself should have a copy of your advance directive. And you've got to make sure that is in your record.
That's right. That's a good point. I don't know if everybody could hear that, but she was saying, when you go into the hospital, your agent may not be with you, and the hospitalist who takes care of the patient is not your primary care doctor, so doesn't know what your advance directive says. So yeah, you should always travel with your advance directive. My wife and I have ours in the glove compartments of all 3 cars. We take them with us when we travel on airplanes. And
It can be scanned into your medical record, and the hospital should be able to get it that way.
that's right. If you have a regular hospital you might go to, like Maine Med or Mercy, they can scan it into your medical record, electronic medical record, and it should be highlighted. Doesn't always work that way, though, I understand. Is that right?
You're looking at me. That's right.
Yeah, Priscilla had some experience where that didn't work well, but her agent was there, and that made all the difference. And your agent has to be able stand up and say, wait, let's hold on for a minute. I just want to know what's going to happen. You're not going to intubate, get that crash cart out of here. This is not what my person wants. And it takes somebody not only who knows your wishes intimately, but someone who has the guts to stand up and make themselves a pain in the neck against the medical establishment, which we normally bow down to, for good reason. Yes.
I had an experience like that, but it was a long time ago in Maine. My father was visiting me. I had his power of attorney, but I didn't have a copy at my vacation home. But they did listen to me. Mm-hmm. Will they still do that? Or do you have to have a piece of paper?
Well, you ran into some very good doctors.
I mean, as I said, it was quite, I don't know, 15 years ago probably.
Yeah.
Before the death and all that.
You should have one, not only in your car, but in all your vacation homes. Yeah, and it's important to know that a copy of the advance directive has the full force of the original signed. So you don't need to go through making multiple copies of signed documents. Yeah, that's a good point.
There's an online database one can put their advance directives in, and then you carry a wallet card which has the necessary information that anybody with access to a computer can then pull down. So maybe it's a little easier than having multiple copies in the car, but that might be a fallback as well. Mm-hmm. Belt and suspenders.
That's a good point. Yeah, you can register to have your advance directive in a database and carry a card that says, "Here's my advance directive. Go look it up." Mm-hmm. How long should an advance directive be? I'm asking that question because I know of somebody who has one that I think runs 40 or 50 pages. I'm probably exaggerating. Well, to cover every instance that you could think of, wouldn't you need to write and write and write and write? But at the time when it's needed, who's going to look at that? Who's going to spend the time with it? So if you have that, maybe you want also a executive summary with the simple, straightforward things. So there's a lot to think about advanced directives. Anything else? Okay, so what are the considerations for voluntarily stopping eating and drinking? Well, the patient should have decision-making capacity, which means, as Steve alluded to, maybe you have to start VSED before you're ready. I might have another good day tomorrow, reasonably good day. So maybe I shouldn't start today. And tomorrow, well, that was a pretty good day. Maybe I shouldn't. And at some point, you lose capacity. And then what? So the way I often look at it is you may have to be willing to sacrifice a few reasonably good days in order to avoid many bad years. And I think that's a way of looking at this trade-off. You will need the support of family, friends, so you have to talk to all these people, let them know your wishes. It's a difficult discussion to have, but the more you do it, the easier it is. And here's sort of the hospice mantra. Hospice neither hastens nor prolongs death. That's the mantra of hospice. So this can present a challenge when we're talking about hastened death. And hospice normally wants to stay far away from hastened death. For example, I think most hospices will not allow their nurse, who has been with the family over time in the hospice situation, they won't allow that nurse to be present when the lethal medication is ingested. And that drives me crazy. I've written to our hospice in Maine, and I gave them an article in which from the nursing journal, which pointed out that this constitutes, in their opinion, patient abandonment. You know, what's the message you're giving? Here you've been the nurse, you've been taking care, you've been with the family. Well, but wait a minute, no, I'm not going to do that. It's, I think it's terrible. But, so I just mention this because in order to get hospice support, you may have to plan well in advance. Call hospice. Have somebody come out and do an intake interview. And maybe you're not ready yet, but it's an opportunity to say, well, when I get to a certain point, I'm going to either do medical aid in dying or VSED, and will you support me at that point? And if they say, well, I don't know, you have two choices. One is to put them on the spot and say, well, I really need to know. And what would be the criteria? Would you come the second day after not eating and drinking? Would the person have to be comatose in order for you to come and be of assistance? What would be the criteria? And the other option, which I highly recommend, is call the next hospice on your list. There are a lot of hospices. Some are nonprofit, some are for-profit, and they may, because of that difference or other differences, compassionate care, they may react differently to a request like that. But this should be done way early. Anybody have any experiences with hospice and hastened death that would? No? Okay. So, what does all this add up to? Well, in a simple one slide, I think all this adds up to you've got to be proactive and start early if you want your wishes about your end of life to be honored. Secondly, try to be realistic and understand your own situation. What's my likely progression? How monitor myself? You know, are things going slowly, quickly? What are my doctors saying? So that you understand the course of your illness. Make your wishes known clearly to everyone you know, your loved ones, your doctors. Recruit and educate a healthcare agent through lots of conversation, not just once. What if this happened? What if that happened? What if I was here? What would I want? And write an advance directive. And we've talked about giving it to everybody you know. Update it. Get all those old copies out of circulation when you update it. And things may change as you age. How often should you update it? Every 5 years, maybe 10 years. If you're as old as I am, maybe more frequently. So that's it. So there's just one more thing. Did everybody get the handouts, by the way? Make sure you have them, if for no other reason than this last page. I've put down 4 things that I think are the most important for someone starting to think about end-of-life issues. The first one is the Maine Advance Directive form. You can get this off the web. I'm sorry I couldn't make a clickable page on paper for you, but you can Google and you'll be able to find that. And then there's the link to Maine Death with Dignity. This is the organization that shepherded the law through and acts as a clearinghouse now, and may have references to physicians who can help you if your physician won't. And then I have two books that I think are both gems. One is Hard Choices for Loving People. 80 pages, that's thin. And it is so easy to read and so packed with useful information. Has anybody read this book? Yeah, a few of you have, particularly people who've been in my class. It's a gem. And I overlooked it many times when I was looking for courses because it was so thin. I thought, what can that be? Well, it's great. And the other one is by Barbara Coombs Lee, who was the head of Compassion and Choices, a national organization about end-of-life issues. And it's called Finish Strong, which I think is a wonderful metaphor, finish strong. And she talks about the most striking thing to me is she has a chapter called, what was it? It was about Alzheimer's. Conquering Alzheimer's or something like that. And she says, here, you have a few choices. Here they are. Boom, boom, boom. And here's how you do it. So any questions about VSED maybe, or other things?
This is other things. You just forgot.
Oh, good.
You forgot a phrase. I suggest that everybody read the book Remember by Lisa DeNova, who wrote Still Alice, which lots of us read a while ago. This book, I think she is a neurologist. Very clearly, she tells us the difference between dementia and aging. And forgetting words is right at the top of, we're all normal when we forget words and phrases and stuff. But it's really worth reading.
Okay, so the book is Remember by the author of Still Alice. And what's her name?
Lisa DeNova.
Lisa DeNova.
Genova?
Yeah.
How is it spelled?
Genova.
Genova. Genova. Thank you. Yes.
I just wanted to clarify one thing about one difference between palliative care and hospice, and that is that palliative care is open to anyone with a terminal diagnosis, no matter how long your prognosis. It could be years, but they specialize in helping the patient and the family come to terms with having a terminal diagnosis, or terminal illness, I should say, and helping you figure out what your life, whatever length it is, should look like. And it helps families come to grips with having a loved one who is eventually going to die. So I just wanted to make that difference. Hospices, you have 6 months or less.
Yeah. So that's a good point. I'll just repeat the highlights. Hospice isn't the only place you can get palliative care. Palliative care is a medical specialty, and it's open to anyone who seeks palliative care, and can be very valuable.
Most hospitals have a director of palliative care.
Yes, that's actually fairly new, but yes, most hospitals do have a palliative care director and department. Yeah.
What is the course you teach and where do you teach it?
I teach it occasionally. Priscilla Platt, who's here, and I developed a course that was 16 contact hours about making decisions at the end of life, which we thought maybe nobody would sign up for that many hours. But we have, it's always been full. And I don't have on my schedule to teach it again. I probably will, or I may. So I can't tell you.
Where do you teach?
Oh, at the OLLI program at the University of Southern Maine, Osher Lifelong Learning for old people. No quizzes, no tests, no big tuition. Yeah, how many people have been to an OLLI class? Oh, yeah, great. Yeah, so you mostly know about it. Yes.
So I wrestled with these two options, and I think about the VSED option could be difficult for families that maybe don't have the support that they need for something like that. And I have some experience with it because, my family helped a loved one die, but it took time and it wasn't easy, and I don't see it as always being a possibility. And the problem with the medical option of ending your life is, if you're of sound mind, then I don't think there is a big problem. I have a dear friend who just took that route. But if you have dementia or Alzheimer's, I think it gets much more complicated and muddied. You don't know how quickly
you don't qualify because you're not going to die in 6 months. Yeah.
So what I have thought about is this, and I just wonder if there's any kind of organization or people out there that are working on something like this. Why couldn't I, as a person of sound mind, do sort of what Pat did, but to write out, maybe even have some kind of a form where I could write out and say, look, I'm okay now, but I don't know how I'll be in 2 or 3 years. I could have dementia, it could progress rapidly. I want to make it clear right now that I want to choose this option. Now, I know right now that wouldn't be legal. I could not choose the death, assisted death.
Right.
But I think that, to me, that would be such a, I see that it would be wrought with some, you have to have lots of safeguards, but I would like to see an option like that, and I wonder if there's any...
There is a way to do that. You have an advance directive.
I do.
Write as much as you want about, if I get Alzheimer's, this is what I want.
And that would work?
It doesn't work.
I'm afraid it
it doesn't legally.
Well,
my brother-in-law knew nobody. He had done all that in California is about as advanced as any state in this country.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't work there.
Well, in what way didn't it work?
They couldn't do anything to hasten his life because he had Alzheimer's and he couldn't administer it himself. He couldn't make the decision. And that's the same.
Well, that's for medical aid in dying, but if he wrote in his advance directive, as I have, if I get dementia, I want to die by stopping eating and drinking, and I want to do it before I lose capacity to make decisions. And I've said, if I don't do it before I lose capacity, I want my agent to make sure that I'm not fed. Now that's not been tested legally, but it may well still work. And it's better than doing nothing. And if you have a family that's behind you and an agent that will stand up for you.
But I think people have tried that and somebody comes in and says you can't do this.
Was he in a hospital?
He was in a very good retirement community in the dementia unit.
Well, I can't speak to the specific issue, but...
Well, I can see that would work at home if, everyone in your family understands your wishes. That could, because no one outside needs to even be involved. But it wouldn't work for the administration of the, potion that would take your life. That wouldn't legally be possible, I don't think. At least with our current laws.
It's possible if you meet the qualifications.
But if you have dementia and you're not a sound mind, you're not meeting the qualifications.
Right.
So that's what I'm trying to say is, I'm thinking about the person that develops Alzheimer's and no longer can coherently make decisions.
Well, that person would have to make some decisions before they lost capacity. You can have Alzheimer's and still have periods of lucidity and able to make decisions on your own. And a doctor will, would take that as your informed decisions.
And so you legally could use the assistance of doctors to end your life?
No.
You could only use the VSED.
The VSED.
And so I'm trying to get at, I wish that we could use doctor-assisted, and I don't think we can. And
No,
I
we
just
can't,
wonder if
but
anyone's
there-
working on that.
But by the time you need it, it might be available because people are realizing around the country, proponents of medical aid in dying, are realizing if you have a terminal illness, why shouldn't that be enough?
When we say we treat our pets better than we treat ourselves.
So the law is in flux and it's being challenged. You know, it used to be that the laws said you had to be a resident of the state. Well, now many states allow non-residents to be treated with medical aid in dying.
Does Maine?
What did I say?
Vermont does that.
Maine, no. No, you still have to be a resident in Maine. Yes.
It took several years to get the Maine Death with Dignity law passed, and there are some shortcomings, let's say, in it. Is anybody working in the legal system to get those items addressed?
Shortcomings being the 6 month.
The 6 months, the capacity, depending on what's wrong with you, let's say, what difficulties you have.
Capacity is probably not one that's going to change soon because that otherwise it looks like euthanasia where the doctor is killing you and they're trying to stay far away from that. But I don't know that there's any active work in Maine to change elements of the law, but there are in other states. So.
There's two things I was thinking of that might be helpful to everyone here. When doing a voluntary stopping eating and drinking, we have this whole thing, we can make videos on our phones and iPads now, and that's often a tool. So way ahead of time, along with your advance directive, you can have a film of yourself saying what you want. It also helps actually during the process. So let's just say I'm the one who chose to do this. I'm the one who's going to be dying. And I'm on day 3, I'm going, whew, I could really go for some key lime pie. And instead of my daughter having to say, but Mom, remember you decided this? Because I also may be getting delusional in all this as you stop drinking. You know, then you get to look at the film at yourself. So you make a pep talk for yourself. It says, hey, Bonesy, remember this? You know? And you're like, and then you're like, oh yeah, that's right. You know, that's a really good tool. And then this may be, well, this is just an interesting organization which I recently joined. It's called Reimagining Dementia. And our society has a real bad rap around Alzheimer's and dementia. And it's not always, you know, that's not always going to be a miserable time, depending. I'm not making any decisions for anyone, but I'm just saying, when I first educated myself about this organization, Reimagining Dementia, I figured it was full of doctors and all this. It's mostly made up of people who have dementia. And because you know how it can go in all kinds of directions. And plenty of us have witnessed it, and some people actually aren't having a horrible time with it. So there's that too. Because I'm trying to reimagine it myself, what it's like. So just maybe dip into that a little bit.
Would you introduce yourself? I think a lot of people here would be very interested in who you are and what you do.
Is that okay with you?
Sure.
Okay. So my name is Andrews Nelson. People call me Bones, not because of my job as a deaf guide, but because I was scrawny. I got that name at 1.5 years old. And I work with people who are at the end of their lives, whether it be they're not at the beginning or the middle of their lives, or whether I do death work with people, let's say that. It could be someone who's had a miscarriage, an abortion. It could be post-mortem stuff where a kid dies in an accident. It could be someone who's diagnosed with 5 months to live. It could be a VSED or a death with dignity option. All these things, it's just death. I could go for a walk with a 25-year-old whose family never dealt with talking about death. So I do death work, let's just say that. And it's never regretted because our culture doesn't deal with it much. And Bill is just recently been trained in becoming a death guide or death doula, as people call it sometimes. And we're going to be doing some work together.
And Andrews was the death guide for Pat Ramsay.
Wonderful work.
Anything else?
I'm going to say I've been thinking about this and reading about this a lot with you and some other people. I find it astonishing how it always feels new when I hear you say all of this that I know I have looked at, but I don't. It's not a place I go very often. I sort of do, and I think I shouldn't be thinking of death all the time, but. Well, yes, maybe I should. I don't know. The processing of this information is not like there's an automatic go into your brain. It's hard to. That makes sense. But.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I just want to end on one thought. We talk about death with dignity, and we talked about hastening death primarily today. But there are many people who die with dignity in ways that are not hastened death. If you have cancer, and particularly if the pain can be controlled, or with any disease, when pain and your suffering is controlled, you may well be willing to go until the disease takes you. And that may be a death with dignity and a time to reconnect with family members. So there's a whole array of things. I didn't want to leave without saying there are other ways to die.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.